Imagine a body of water so vast that it stretched across an area larger than Ireland. A shimmering inland sea in the heart of Central Asia, teeming with fish, surrounded by thriving port cities, and supporting an entire way of life for millions of people. Now imagine that same sea reduced to a toxic, salt-crusted desert, with rusting ships sitting in sand where waves once lapped against their hulls. This is not science fiction. This is the story of the Aral Sea, and it happened within a single human lifetime. For thousands of years, the Aral Sea sat on the border between modern-day Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan. Fed by two mighty rivers, the Amu Darya and the Sir Darya, it was the fourth largest lake on the planet. Its waters covered roughly 68,000 square kilometers, an area comparable to the entire country of Sri Lanka. At its deepest points, it plunged nearly 70 meters beneath the surface. Fishing communities dotted its shores. The city of Moynak in Uzbekistan was a bustling port, home to a fishing fleet that hauled in tens of thousands of tons of fish every year. More than 20 unique species of fish thrived in its waters, many found nowhere else on Earth. People built their lives, their culture, and their economy around this enormous body of water. It had been there for millennia. Surely it would be there forever. But in the 1960s, the Soviet Union had other plans. Soviet central planners looked at the vast arid lands of Central Asia and saw an opportunity. Cotton, sometimes called white gold, was one of the most valuable crops on Earth, and the flat terrain of Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan was perfect for growing it. There was just one problem. Cotton is an incredibly thirsty crop. It can require over 10,000 liters of water to produce a single kilogram of fiber. Growing it in a desert requires enormous amounts of water. So Soviet engineers began one of the most ambitious and ultimately catastrophic irrigation projects in human history. They built a massive network of canals to divert water from the Amu Darya and the Sir Darya away from the Aral Sea and into cotton fields. The largest of these, the Karakum Canal, stretched over 1,300 kilometers across the desert, making it one of the longest irrigation canals ever constructed. Water that had flowed into the Aral Sea for thousands of years was now being redirected on an industrial scale, and it worked, at least for the cotton. Uzbekistan became one of the largest cotton producers in the world, but the cost was almost unimaginable. By the 1970s, the Aral Sea had already begun to shrink noticeably. The rivers that fed it were delivering a fraction of their former flow. In some years, the Sir Darya barely reached the sea at all. The water level dropped year after year, and the shoreline began to retreat. Fishing villages that had once sat on the coast found themselves kilometers from the water's edge. But the Soviet government pressed on, prioritizing cotton production over all else. Internal reports warning of ecological disaster were classified and buried. Some Soviet officials even acknowledged privately that the Aral Sea would have to be sacrificed, viewing it as an acceptable price for agricultural output. Through the 1980s, the decline accelerated. The sea split into two separate bodies of water, the North Aral Sea in Kazakhstan and the larger South Aral Sea in Uzbekistan. The water that remained grew saltier and saltier as evaporation concentrated the minerals. Salinity levels eventually rose to levels comparable to the ocean, then surpassed them entirely. Fish populations collapsed. Species that had evolved over thousands of years in this unique ecosystem simply died off. The commercial fishing industry, which had once employed tens of thousands of people and produced 1/6 of the entire Soviet fish catch, ceased to exist entirely. The Cannery in Moynak, which had processed fish from the Aral Sea, began importing fish from the Pacific Ocean, thousands of kilometers away, just to keep its workers employed. And then came the ships. As the water retreated, it left behind dozens of fishing vessels and cargo ships stranded on dry land. These rusting hulks became the most haunting symbol of the disaster. Photographs of ships sitting in sand dunes, their paint peeling in the harsh desert sun, became iconic images of environmental destruction. The ship graveyard at Moynak, once a port city, now sits more than 150 kilometers from the nearest water. Tourists travel from around the world to see these ghostly remnants, walking across cracked earth that was once a seabed. But the visible devastation was only part of the story. The exposed seabed contained decades of accumulated pesticides and fertilizer runoff from the cotton fields. Soviet-era weapons testing on an island in the Aral Sea had also left behind deposits of anthrax, plague bacteria, and other biological agents, now lying exposed on open ground. As the wind swept across the dry lakebed, it picked up toxic dust and salt and carried it across the region. This poisonous dust settled on farmland, contaminating crops. It blew into towns and cities where people breathed it in daily. Health consequences were devastating. The region around the former Aral Sea saw skyrocketing rates of respiratory illness, throat cancer, kidney disease, and anemia. Infant mortality in some areas near the former shoreline was among the highest in the world. The local climate itself changed. The Aral Sea had acted as a temperature moderator, keeping summers cooler and winters milder for the surrounding region. Without it, summers became hotter and drier, winters became colder and harsher, and the growing season shortened by several critical weeks. The very agriculture that had caused the sea's destruction was now being undermined by the consequences of that destruction. It was a cruel and ironic feedback loop. By 2003, the South Aral Sea had broken into eastern and western sections. The eastern lobe would eventually dry up almost completely, becoming little more than a thin seasonal puddle. Overall, the Aral Sea had lost roughly 90% of its surface area and 97% of its volume compared to its 1960 levels. What had taken nature thousands of years to create, human engineering had destroyed in just 4 decades. Now, you might wonder whether anyone tried to stop this. The answer is complicated. After the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, the newly independent Central Asian nations inherited both the cotton economy and the ecological catastrophe. Uzbekistan continued large-scale cotton farming, maintaining much of the Soviet-era irrigation system. Much of this farming relied on forced labor, with citizens compelled to harvest cotton each autumn in a system that persisted well into the 21st century. Turkmenistan expanded the Karakum Canal. Water politics between the 5 Central Asian countries became a constant source of tension, with upstream nations controlling flow that downstream nations desperately needed. But Kazakhstan took a different path. In 2005, with funding from the World Bank, Kazakhstan completed the Kok-Aral Dam, a 13-kilometer dike that separated the North Aral Sea from the south. The idea was simple but bold. Rather than trying to save the entire sea, focus all available water on the smaller northern section. And remarkably, it worked. Within just 2 years, the North Aral Sea began to rise. Water levels increased, salinity dropped, and fish began to return. Flounder, carp, and other species that had vanished started appearing in nets again. The city of Aralsk, which had been stranded far from the shoreline, saw water creeping closer. Today, the North Aral Sea has recovered significantly. Fish populations have rebounded, and a small commercial fishing industry has restarted. The South Aral Sea, however, remains largely a lost cause. Uzbekistan has not implemented comparable conservation measures, and the water demands of cotton irrigation continue. The eastern basin has essentially vanished. Some international efforts have focused on planting saxaul trees and other vegetation on the exposed seabed to reduce toxic dust storms, and these have shown some success. But restoring the South Aral Sea to anything approaching its former size would require a fundamental transformation of the region's agricultural economy. The story of the Aral Sea is often called the greatest environmental disaster of the 20th century, and it carries lessons that extend far beyond Central Asia. Around the world, we are repeating variations of the same mistake. The Colorado River in the United States frequently runs dry before reaching the ocean, drained by farms and cities. Lake Chad in Africa has shrunk by 90% since the 1960s. Iran's Lake Urmia has lost most of its volume. In each case, the pattern is the same. Short-term economic interests override long-term ecological sustainability, and by the time the consequences become undeniable, the damage is extraordinarily difficult to reverse. What makes the Aral Sea story so powerful is its speed and completeness. This was not a slow geological process playing out over centuries. People who swam in the Aral Sea as children lived to see it become a desert. Fishermen who hauled in catches as young men watched their boats become museum pieces in the sand. An entire ecosystem, an entire way of life, an entire sea, gone within a single generation. Those rusting ships in the desert are more than just a striking photograph, they are a warning. They tell us that the natural systems we depend on are not indestructible. They tell us that decisions made in distant offices can erase what nature built over millennia. And they remind us that, once some things are lost, no amount of regret or engineering can bring them fully back. The Aral Sea did not disappear because of a natural disaster. It disappeared because people decided that cotton was more important than a sea. And the desert that replaced it asks us a question we still have not fully answered. What else are we willing to lose?